Hello there, welcome back to my Good Enough Mum page, and today I'm talking about why is it difficult to ask for help. And there's several things, and I'll quickly summarise them to start with. I think we can be feeling a sense of shame when we ask for help, or we can feel that we're not important enough, or we could be filled with fear about what asking for help might mean. And I'm going to cover each of those points in turn. So firstly, I was thinking about shame and the fact that we have a lot of shoulds that we carry around in our heads, and that can be due to various messages that we've internalised over the years. But some of the things that can go through our heads in stopping us from reaching out to people can be things like, I should have worked it out for myself. And I'm just looking at my paper here. I should be more capable. I should be able to do it by myself. And often that can be accompanied by a sense of not really being good enough as we are. And this can stem from where perhaps we've been in a large family, or perhaps our parents have been busy and we've received the message that our concerns really aren't that important, that they're probably trivial even. And so that can leave us with a feeling of that you were not important enough to ask for help, that we're going to waste people's time, or that our particular problem is too small for people to bother with, and they're probably too busy anyway to deal with us. And personally, I find it quite difficult in asking for help to do with medical things, because I think about the NHS and I think about the GP and I think, oh, you know, they must be so busy at the moment, I can't ask for help. And that's about, for me, a challenge to learn that I am important enough and that I need to ask for help, and there's nothing wrong with asking for help when I need it. And then lastly, I think there's this sense of fear as well. And I think this is particularly true when we're talking about seeking emotional help, because we think that if we begin to open up, we might actually be overwhelmed, and perhaps the feelings that we uncork, if we take the stopper out of the bottle, that if we spill out all our feelings, it's going to be too much. It might be too much for us, and it could in fact be too much for the listener. And so we tend to hide away, we tend to hide behind behaviour that perhaps shows people that we do need help, but in a very sort of indirect way, so that if necessary we can laugh it off. And sometimes what I find when I'm with people and working with people in the counselling room, you can often tell that someone's actually quite frightened if they bring a lot of humour into the room. There's nothing wrong with humour, and sometimes humour is a good leveller and it helps us to talk about things that perhaps are difficult initially to talk about. But if someone is using humour when they're talking to us and they're laughing about something that perhaps isn't really a laughing matter, I think that's just helpful for us as listeners to note that somebody is perhaps trying to communicate something to us that's really important, and that they need to know that we honour them and respect them and value what they've got to share. That's what I try to do when I'm working with people in counselling. And something else that we can do is, it can be so difficult to talk about things that we begin to try and rescue ourselves, and we begin to look to other behaviours that bring comfort to us. And that can mean that if it's really difficult for people to talk about things, so perhaps they've been brought up to have a stiff upper lip, or perhaps they feel ashamed of having a problem, or they feel embarrassed about whatever it is that's troubling them, even to the point where they find it difficult to admit to themselves. Quite often people will begin to engage in comforting behaviour, which can be anything that seems unhealthy, such as smoking too much or drinking too much or eating too much. And it can also be behaviours that initially seem quite healthy but can become quite obsessive. So that could be over-exercising, for example, to the point where they're not taking notice of the injuries that their bodies are telling them that they need to listen to. And we can take comfort in those different activities, but in actual fact all we're doing is we're actually covering up what really needs to be dealt with. And it is really hard, and it's really hard to untangle all of that. And it's helpful, I think, to be able to do that untangling with someone who can listen well. And that's what I try to do in counselling. I'm not saying I get it right every time. But certainly counselling can be a place where you can untangle some of those feelings with someone who's quite skilled and sensitive in listening to what's going on, perhaps beneath the initial words, but really listening to what's going on underneath that the person's too frightened to share. And so there's lots of barriers to being able to talk about things. We can feel really embarrassed, and we can feel that we shouldn't feel the way we should be the way we are feeling. But in fact, we can't help the way we're feeling. And what can happen is, if we begin to share, we can find that we're not alone in what we feel. We can feel that we're not important enough to share. But that's an old story that we've perhaps inherited from various situations in our life. And if something's causing us distress, then yes, it is important. It's important to us if it's upsetting us, and if it's causing us difficulties in our life, it's important. It's not trivial. And finally, I think it can be very frightening to think about our feelings. It can be very frightening to think, if I open up, where is it ever going to end? But sometimes it's actually helpful to be alongside those feelings. It's helpful to really express them. And once we get to the point where they are fully expressed, it then brings healing to us, and we're able to move on from that place. And so that fear, although it's a very real fear, sometimes we need to enter into that fear. We need to face it down, and we need to talk. So if you'd like to talk, please do feel free to contact me. And also, if you'd like to have a look at my blog, which will expand on these points, that'll be at thegoodenoughmum.com/blog later in the week. Thanks for listening. Bye.